Have you noticed that Xinjiang has pretty much disappeared from Western headlines these days? A couple of years ago, you couldn't move for stories claiming repression, human rights violations, even genocide. That was during the COVID pandemic time when China was effectively closed. But now, with Xinjiang freely accessible and the world able to see the true picture for themselves, the stories seem to have suddenly disappeared. Another reason why few dare to continue spreading disinformation about Xinjiang is, I believe, thanks to the rigorous work of academics like Jaq James. Drawing on her background in law, she has completely debunked some of the most atrocious claims and narratives against China and Xinjiang. Welcome to this special edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing with me, Lu Xin. I'm particularly excited about this one because now I have the opportunity to finally pick Jaq's brains and find out exactly how these claims crumble under scrutiny. Jaq, joining me from the city of Guilin in southwest China, welcome to The Point.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jaq, just a quick word about your educational background. Now, you're Australian, you have a Master of Public Policy from Australia's National University, a Master of Education from the University of Southern Queensland, and you're currently undertaking a Master of Law, specialising in international law with the Australian National University. And you were actually admitted as a lawyer with the Supreme Court of the Australian Capital Territory in 2012. So you could have had a very comfortable career by going down the law path, and yet you decided to fight the fights for Xinjiang and against powerful institutions such as the ASPI, the Australian think tank we all know by now, Amnesty International, even the United Nations. How did it all start, and what motivates you?
It was purely accidental. During COVID, I was doing freelance legal research. And then one day, a Xinjiang company heard about me and asked if I could help them sue the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Australia for their Uyghurs for Sale report, because they had lost all of their purchaser contracts because of that report and had to sack all of their Uyghur workers. And I had read the report, the ASPI report, in 2020, and I could see that it was problematic. But I didn't realize just how severe the harms were on the ground in Xinjiang until I heard from this company. So I got curious, I dug deep into the case and returned to law school at Australian National University to study international law to see what I could do to help the Uyghurs who had lost their jobs because of these Western narratives.
What have you found from that ASPI analysis, and which have set you off on this path, debunking one after another these kind of reports from powerful houses such as, Amnesty International, the Human Rights Watch, even the UN Human Rights Office?
Well, you're right. I have looked at a lot of reports from these Western institutions and international institutions. And I guess if I was being charitable, I would describe them as junk research, but a lot of it is just disinformation. And I can explain why I view it that way.
Ever since you have tried several endeavors, for instance, you had a website called Co-West Pro, and then now you have set up another platform called Geo-Law Narratives. You actually have a YouTube channel where you put up a recent video to very critical acclaim. People even want to contribute to what you're doing. What are you trying to do with these efforts, these content, and for what purpose?
Well, my training is in law. I am an admitted lawyer, so therefore I care about the law, and I care about evidence, and I care about facts. And all of these principles and institutions that you're trained to hold dear to your heart when you go through law school have just been bastardized by all of these institutions. So I guess it's the lawyer in me that wants to protect the legal frameworks, the international law framework, and also wants to protect victims, to get justice for victims. Also, as an Australian, I have a vested interest because we were talking a few years ago about going to war with China. And the propaganda, the war propaganda, which by the way is illegal under international law, was trying to link the impetus to go to war with the narratives in Xinjiang. So it's really slippery slope stuff. So a lot of this has to be cleaned up. And these are things that are motivating me.
Some people would say, how do you support yourself? Because you had an income, you had a job as a lawyer in Australia. Now you're living in China, teaching in university. Who are funding your work? Because it takes months, if not longer, to read these papers, to debunk them. You know, you have very long research papers, 60, 70 pages, and to produce videos. So some would say, have you been bought by the Chinese government? Are you a mouthpiece for the Chinese government? What would you say to that?
It's funny because I've made myself so poor by helping the Uyghurs and I'm helping the Chinese government get the facts right. The fact of the matter is everything I do of my own volition, I support myself. I did initially have a fundraiser. This was at the time when I was trying to launch a lawsuit against the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And I have to say, Australians were very, very generous. I think in total was about 40,000 Australian dollars was donated to me because of my work. I'm no longer asking for donations. I just do it myself. But I do have to say that I'm very thankful to my current employer. They're not standing in the way of my work. And it's just something that I do in my own hours.
I see. So it's a passion. You're really passionate.
It's a passion project.
Yeah, about
passion project, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about your most recent piece of work, a major piece of work, which is about the U.S. legislation called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA. It was passed in December 2021 and came into effect in June 2022. Now, that law is said to prevent products produced in part or entirely in Xinjiang from entry in the United States because of the forced labor involved. In your legal analysis, you claim that the act flips everything we know about the rule of law on its head. You said it likely violates a gamut of international laws, revealing that the United States is no friend of the free market, no ally of the world's poor, and no believer in a rule-based international order. Exactly, where can we start talking about this work?
Where can we start? My goodness. Well, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is really extraordinary because of the fact that it just targets one region in the world, which is so discriminatory. And then it also flips the presumption of innocence on its head. The act, it starts with the presumption of guilt, and then you have to prove otherwise, which is already a really hard thing to do. But then when you look at the evidence, the evidentiary threshold that importers have to clear in order to get their goods into the US is really something extraordinary. And the reason why I say it's extraordinary is because you can compare it to a law that was already in existence that could deal with forced labor. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was not necessary. It was all theatrics. It was all political theatrics. But if you look at the Tariff Act, Section 307 of the Tariff Act, it gives importers, there is no presumption of guilt. There's the presumption of innocence unless there's a reasonable suspicion to be had. Then the presumption gets split. So once that gets split, then the importer only needs to provide, effectively, 2 documents to clear their name. The certificate of origin from the last seller and the subjective opinion based on their own investigations of whether their goods are forced labor free. And the evidentiary threshold, it is satisfactory evidence. Now, you look at the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The evidentiary threshold is clear and convincing evidence, which is much higher than the Tariff Act. And then you have, on top of that, dozens and dozens and dozens of documents, which really are impossible to satisfy, that you have to pass over to customs to get your shipment in. So the the act is designed to make importers fail, and the statistics show it because 60% of shipments have been denied.
Before we talk about the actual impact, you said it's against international law. In what specific ways, in which specific international laws is this act running against? Would you name probably the most important one?
Well, I would say World Trade Organization rules are being violated. Article 1 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and Article 11. And also I would say that the right to racial equality under the UN Charter and the right to economic development under the UN Charter have been violated, as well as, and this is important, the right to work under Article 6 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. That last right, the right to work, I hold a special place in my heart for that right, because I know that that is the solution to poverty, the right to work. Not handouts, not welfare, real jobs, real work. And this act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, just steals all of that away from the Uyghurs. We're already struggling due to poverty.
Well, some people would say the United States is not a signatory to some of the international covenants or international legal documents. What would be your argument? For instance, the U.S. is not signatory to the International Covenant on the Socio-Economic Rights. They would say we're not part of it, so we don't have to, stand by it.
They can say that, but they can't deny the rhetorical weight of the fact that they are violating that convention. Because it's about global consensus. The world sat together and said that these are universal rights that need to be protected, and really just shame on the US for not ratifying that convention.
You've also noted that the act, rather than protect ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, actually presumes that anybody who employs or hires ethnic minorities could be involved in forced labor, which means all ethnic minority people in Xinjiang, if they work, they will be cast as forced labor. Is that what the US Act is really saying? I mean, how could they assume that everything produced in Xinjiang, or presume that everything that's produced in Xinjiang is involving ethnic minority, or not even involving ethnic minority, anything produced by any company is done with forced labor? Is that the presumption that the act is pointing to?
That's my interpretation of Category 2 of the blacklist that goes along with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The way how I see it is that it does racially profile the Xinjiang ethnic minority group and unilaterally declares them to be illegal workers, therefore solidifying their fate of being carved out of supply chains, international supply chains.
Can someone fight for their interests and say we did not source materials from an entity that potentially use forced labor? Could they appeal the decision as made by the U.S. Justice Department or relevant government bodies involved in implementing this act?
No, that's another extraordinary thing about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. There's no right of appeal for entities who are listed by the US government. They can submit new information, but just based on the information that the US government has, they can declare that you are a forced labor organization, and that's the end of the story, which really just goes to show that the US has no respect for the rule of law, because it's not really supporting natural justice and due process.
There are countries which have really serious forced labor or slavery issues, according to international tallies or indicators that specialize in this area. And China is not, the top countries with the highest risk of forced labor or slavery. And yet, it seems that the U.S. is not really concerned about products produced in these countries entering the U.S. market, but specifically against, Xinjiang or maybe the DPRK or North Korea as the only other exception. Why is that? Have you thought about it?
Yeah, well, when I was studying this, one of the things I did consider was, well, where does China sit in the global slavery index? Surely it's got to be in the top 10 or top 3 to justify special legislation targeting China. And lo and behold, I discover that China's not even in the top 10. You have all of these other countries that have far greater risk of forced labor, but they don't have as much geopolitical value to the US because, as we know, China is United States' biggest economic and strategic rival. So I think that global slavery index is a real giveaway to what the real intentions are of the US. It is about containment of a competitor. It is not about human rights. If they did care about human rights, then there'd be 10 other pieces of legislation targeting the more riskier countries, but they're not doing that.
Would you elaborate a bit further on that? You're saying basically the US is targeting Xinjiang not because of potential human rights violations, but because of economic consideration, or trying to choke off China as a competitor in some of the most competitive industries. Would you go a bit further to elaborate on that? What are some of the evidences you have to support this claim?
Well, if you have a look at the most targeted industries by U.S. Customs, it's the automotive industry, the aerospace industry, and these are industries that America is competing with. And recently, the CSIS has released a report celebrating the fact that a lot of these companies that have divested or separated themselves from Xinjiang are moving into America. So they're taking jobs from the Uyghurs and taking jobs out of China into America based on false premises. I call the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act the Tanya Harding of legislation. Instead of competing fairly, they're just trying to kneecap China. But there's another reason why I believe that this is about economic containment, and that is the geopolitical value of Xinjiang itself. For example, if you read the recent book by Jeff Raby, he's an Australian ambassador, former Australian ambassador to China, and he really makes clear the strategic significance of Xinjiang in Eurasia and how all these different countries throughout history have tried to get a piece of Xinjiang, tried to get their hand on Xinjiang. And this is because it is the trade corridor between Beijing and Eurasia, Central Asia and Europe. So it makes sense. It makes sense why the U.S. is targeting that region in particular.
Indeed, if you look at the latest CSIS update on the impact of the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, it didn't say almost nothing about the impact on improving so-called human rights situation of ethnic minorities, but it started and goes on and on about how companies are divesting and going back to the United States. So it seems that they are very much concerned about the economic impacts of or the economic gains that the United States has made rather than the gains for the rights and benefits of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. Also very interesting, you were using this sentence, which I found to be quite almost funny. You said to have such an act to stop forced labor in Xinjiang or in China, what they claim to be forced labor, is like to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. Exactly what do you mean by that? Why do you make such an analogy?
The reason why I say that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is trying to crack an egg with a sledgehammer, because you just have to look at the statistics that's put out by U.S. Customs. As I had mentioned earlier, 40% of shipments are eventually cleared, while 60% are denied. 40%, that's a huge amount to be detained sitting at the ports waiting for clearance. When if it's not a high risk region, and it's not, because we know that from the Global Slavery Index, it just doesn't make sense to insert these delays. Those delays come with costs. And then even with the 60% denial, I don't believe that they've identified forced labor in that 60% volume. It really comes down to, from my perspective, that the US government has set such a high evidentiary standard for clearing the bar that it's almost impossible for importers to do this. That's why I said it's a sledgehammer.
One of the astonishing thing is people are taking it for facts that there is forced labor in Xinjiang. I mean, some people in the West, whether they choose to believe so, whether they really actually do believe in so, in this narrative. And one of the main reasons they quote or they cite is a August 2022 report by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was not signed by the High Commissioner herself at that time. But anyway, this report was released. It claimed that crimes against humanity may have been committed in Xinjiang. But you have debunked that report very thoroughly in as one of your major works, and you said you very much thought it was not professional and it was not reliable. What is the number one reason you say so?
It's a little bit difficult to pick one reason, because the problem when you're in a defensive position, which is what I'm taking, is that the other side has it really easy. They can just throw out these rhetorical bombs. Oh, there's forced labor, there's crimes against humanity, there's genocide. That's easy. But then to try and explain why it's not the case, it's a very boring and convoluted process. You have to go back to the law, you have to go back to the definitions, you have to go back to the evidence, and slowly but surely build the case of why your opposition is incorrect. But what I would say about the UN's report is really the people who worked on it should be ashamed of themselves, because it is their role to protect the human rights of ethnic minorities who are disadvantaged, in this case, poverty, but also because of extremist ideology that was going on in the region. That extremist ideology was going to put structural impediments in the way of young girls and women reaching their full potential, whether it was educational or economic, or even family potential. So by just accepting on really weak evidence these forced labor allegations or these atrocity allegations, they're doing a disservice to groups that they are supposed to be protecting. If I have to pick one standout thing, I wish I could go into everything. If I have to pick out one standard thing, it's how small the interviewed sample size was to draw these conclusions. They interviewed 40 people in total. That is not a reliable sample size. It would not stand up in a court of law. It would not even stand up in any standard statistics class at university. And yet, that report is waved around as if it's something reliable. It is not, and it is a black mark against the UN's name.
What would you say to the ordinary people who are being misled by this kind of reporting carried by, the mainstream media?
Actually, I would prefer to speak to the Islamic world and the Muslim diaspora in Western nations. Like your brothers and sisters were falling behind because of poverty, because of extremist ideology, particularly the Muslim diaspora in the West. They get to enjoy all of the advances that we have in the West: education, health, contraception health, economic opportunities. Why do they not want that extended to their Muslim brothers and sisters in Xinjiang? That's what the Chinese government was trying to do. They have an obligation under international law to emancipate young females, to emancipate the downtrodden, to give them economic opportunities, education opportunities, and importantly, the right to life. The terrorism that had just blanketed the region was destroying the stability of the region. The Uyghur Muslims also deserve peace too. So I would implore the Islamic world, please put a critical eye to everything that comes out of these Western institutions. Don't accept it at face value. And please, since these narratives are built around law, please stick to the law. Laws have strict definitions. Laws have evidentiary thresholds. If you're going to make these allegations, you have to meet the legal requirements. Very little meets the legal requirements.
Finally, I got 1 minute left. Jaq, you must have received a lot of flack and made quite some enemy because you're a warrior. You pull no punches and you name names. Why are you not deterred? In a couple of sentences, if you will.
Well, I'm not. Look, it's my personality. I'm very stubborn. That's all it is. I'm just a very stubborn person. But look, also because it's the right thing to do. Who is standing up for the truth, and who is standing up for the Uyghurs, other than the Chinese government? Very few people are. I also feel that because of my Islamic heritage and my Central Asian heritage, I have a greater empathy for what is going on in Xinjiang. And this is probably an emotional reason why I interest myself in this project.
Almost forgot, Jaq, I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk about it because you were critical on China's side as well in doing a poor job in terms of international communication, in terms of putting up a very formidable and sound rebuttal, even legal action against such legislation. Would you elaborate just a little bit on that front? What could China do better, potentially?
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to address the other side. And I guess as an outsider, as a foreigner, when I look to the Chinese government, I often feel disappointed by their responses to these Western narratives. In the West, we're really good at rhetoric, and we're really good at weaponizing international law, human rights law, turning it into a sword against the global South. And I just constantly look to China and just think, when are you going to rise to the rhetorical occasion? When are you going to learn how to use human rights as a sword and a shield and attack back and protect your downtrodden effectively? Because the international marketplace of ideas, which is something that I believe in, needs symmetry. At the moment, it's monopolized by the talent in the West. So I would urge the Chinese government, if they don't have it already, to bolster their international law and rhetoric expertise.
Thank you so much, Jaq, for being honestly wanting to help here, not for any particular selfish interest, but for passion for justice, I understand. Thank you, Jaq James, joining us from Guilin in southwest China, an Australian legal expert who is now teaching in the university sector in Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region. Keep up the good work. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.